He grew up in a home where love came with bruises, spent his life desperate for approval he never received, built himself into a respected businessman and community figure, and buried 26 of his victims underneath his own house. Today, we're exploring the life and crimes of John Wayne Gacy, one of the most disturbing serial killers in American history. If you enjoy deep dives into true crime, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Let's begin. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the second of 3 children born to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. On the surface, his family appeared to be a typical working-class Catholic household. But behind closed doors, the Gacy home was defined by one thing above all else: fear of his father. John Stanley Gacy Sr. was a strict, cold, and frequently violent man who drank heavily and had little patience for weakness of any kind. He was verbally and physically abusive toward his wife and children, and he reserved a particular cruelty for his son John. No matter what young John did or achieved, it was never enough for his father. He was called a sissy, told he would amount to nothing, and beaten without warning or mercy. John Jr. desperately wanted his father's love and approval throughout his entire childhood and never received it. That wound never healed. As a child, Gacy also suffered from a heart condition that prevented him from participating in sports and physical activities, further isolating him from his peers and deepening his sense of inadequacy. At the age of 11, he was struck on the head by a swing, causing a blood clot in his brain that went undetected for years and caused periodic blackouts throughout his adolescence. He was not a strong student and struggled socially throughout his school years. He dropped out of high school and drifted between jobs and cities for several years, eventually enrolling in a business college in Chicago and showing his first real signs of ambition and drive. He moved to Springfield, Illinois, where he worked as a management trainee for a shoe company and began building the kind of respectable, community-oriented life that his father had always told him he was incapable of. In 1964, he married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, and the couple relocated to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy managed a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant owned by his father-in-law. He threw himself into community involvement, joining the JCs, a civic organization, where he quickly rose to prominence and was widely praised for his energy, leadership, and charisma. He was liked. He was respected. He was the kind of man people wanted at their community events and fundraisers. But in 1968, everything unraveled for the first time. Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting 2 teenage boys who had worked for him. He was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in the Iowa State Reformatory. His wife divorced him almost immediately. His father, the man whose approval he had chased his entire life, died of cirrhosis of the liver in 1969, before John was released from prison. They never reconciled. Gacy was a model prisoner and was released on parole after just 18 months. He returned to Chicago, moved in with his mother, and began rebuilding his life with a determination that, to those around him, seemed almost admirable. He started his own construction company, PDM Contractors, which became genuinely successful. He remarried in 1971 to a woman named Carol Hoff, who had 2 daughters from a previous marriage. He bought a house on Summerdale Avenue in the Chicago suburb of Norwood Park Township. He threw parties, he cooked for his neighbors. He performed at children's hospitals and charitable events, dressed as a character he created himself. Pogo the Clown. He was, by every outward appearance, a model citizen, a self-made businessman, a generous neighbor, a man who had turned his life around. Nobody suspected a thing. Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and teenage boys. His victims were predominantly young, white, all and vulnerable, runaways, drifters, and young men looking for work. Many of them were lured in by the promise of construction jobs or cash. Others were picked up late at night in areas known for male prostitution. Some were employees of his own company. His method was calculated and deeply sinister. He would invite young men to his home, wine and dine them, and then demonstrate what he called the handcuff trick, convincing them to put on handcuffs as part of a magic trick or game, telling them he would show them how to get out. Once they were restrained, the trick was over. They were completely at his mercy. He would strangle his victims, often using a tourniquet method, with a rope or board, sometimes while they were still pleading and conscious. Afterward, he would dispose of the bodies in the crawl space beneath his house, lime and filling the graves himself. When the crawl space ran out of room, he began throwing bodies into the Des Plaines River. All of this happened beneath a house where his wife lived, where he hosted neighborhood barbecues, where children came to play, and where he entertained guests as the charming and gregarious host they all knew and loved. The smell that neighbors occasionally noticed coming from the property was explained away as plumbing problems or dead animals. Nobody questioned it further. His double life was so complete, so meticulously maintained, that even those closest to him had absolutely no idea. He was Pogo the Clown at the weekends and a murderer in the crawl space on weeknights. The contrast was as chilling as anything in the history of American crime. The investigation that finally brought Gacy down began in December 1978, with the disappearance of a 15-year-old boy named Robert Peast, who had gone to meet Gacy about a construction job and never came home. When investigators looked into Gacy's background and discovered his prior conviction for sexual assault, they obtained a search warrant for his property. What they found inside that house changed everything. The smell alone told investigators something was deeply wrong. When they began excavating the crawl space, they found the first body. Then another. Then another. Gacy was arrested on December 21st, 1978. Over the following weeks, investigators recovered 26 bodies from the crawl space of his home on Summerdale Avenue. 3 more victims were later pulled from the Des Plaines River, bringing the confirmed total to 33, though some investigators believed there may have been more. Gacy confessed to the murders. He attempted an insanity defense at trial, claiming he suffered from multiple personality disorder and that an alter ego named Jack was responsible for the killings. The prosecution dismantled this defense methodically and completely. Psychiatrists who evaluated him concluded that he was legally sane and fully aware of what he had done. In 1980, John Wayne Gacy was convicted of 33 counts of murder, the most murder convictions in American history at that time. He was sentenced to death on 12 of those counts. What followed was one of the longest stays on death row in Illinois history. Gacy spent 14 years awaiting execution, during which time he became something of a grotesque cultural phenomenon. For he gave interviews from prison, spoke at length to journalists and researchers, and took up oil painting, producing hundreds of canvases, many of them featuring clowns. Those paintings sold for thousands of dollars, a fact that horrified the families of his victims and sparked widespread public outrage. He maintained throughout his time on death row that many of the murders had been committed by employees of his construction company, attempting to shift responsibility even as the evidence against him was overwhelming and undeniable. He showed little genuine remorse. He was calculating and performative until the very end. Not everyone Gacy targeted lost their life. Several young men survived encounters with him, and their accounts provided critical insight into his methods and behavior. Jeffrey Rignall was one of the most prominent survivors. In 1978, he was lured into Gacy's car, chloroformed, taken to the Summerdale Avenue house, and subjected to hours of assault before being dumped in a park. He survived, reported the attack to police, and actually tracked Gacy down himself by sitting near highways and watching for his car, providing police with the license plate that helped build the case against him. His bravery was extraordinary. Robert Donnelly also survived an attack by Gacy in 1977, describing an ordeal of hours during which Gacy repeatedly choked him to the point of unconsciousness. Gacy reportedly told him at one point that he had done this before and knew exactly what he was doing. The accounts of survivors painted a portrait of a man who was utterly in control during his attacks, methodical, calm, and completely aware of what he was doing. There was no alter ego. There was no Jack. There was only Gacy. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. He was 52 years old. His last meal was a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, the same chain he had managed at the beginning of his adult life. His last words were reported to be, "Kiss my ass." Outside the prison, crowds gathered. Some held signs bearing the names of his victims. Others celebrated. For the families of 33 young men whose bodies had been pulled from a crawl space and a river, it was the end of a chapter that had begun with a knock on a door and a promise of work. John Wayne Gacy was a businessman, a community leader, a clown at children's hospitals, and a killer who buried his victims beneath his own feet. He was the monster that nobody saw coming, because he had spent his entire life making sure nobody would. 33 young men never came home. Their names deserve to be spoken, their stories deserve to be told, and their lives deserve to be remembered as far more than a footnote in the story of the man who took them. That is the dark truth about John Wayne Gacy, and it always will be. Thanks everyone for watching. See you again in the next episode, and don't forget to like and subscribe.